All right, this is for the 117 class. I've lost track of the numbers of the chapters, but I believe it's chapter 23 is China and Japan, tradition and change in East Asia. Okay, I'm not going to talk about a lot of the details that are in there. What I mainly want to do is draw out the fact that China, until about the middle of the 19th century, is a very prosperous, very powerful political entity. Okay, the Empire of China. It has this very, very long history, like 2,000 years of one dynasty after another, with periods in between where there's chaos and people struggling over different things, and peasant rebellions and secret societies and all sorts of stuff. But eventually somebody comes to prominence and unifies the country and starts a new dynasty. Okay, in Europe, by contrast, when the fall of Rome occurs in the 5th century, nobody's able to put it back together. Today Europe is as unified as it's ever been, and even so, England is moving out with Brexit and that kind of stuff. There's problems there. Charlemagne tries to unite Europe, and then Napoleon tries to unite Europe. Hitler tries to unite Europe under his dominance, and they all fail. Okay. So that's one thing. China has this very different, very different way of looking at history. And it's always once it's unified, it's a giant area and a large population that's ruled by one single person. Okay. Unlike Europe, where there's an Austrian king, there's the Holy Roman Emperor, there's a king in England, there are kings in France, Kaisers in Germany, etc., etc., czars in Russia. It's a very different kind of situation. When you have a situation like that, there's not as much war in China as there is in Europe. So there's not as much development of firearms and stuff. Even though they invent gunpowder, they don't quite turn it into weapons of war as efficiently as Europeans will, because Europeans are constantly fighting. Now, one of the ways to really get a sense of the balance of power between, say, China and Europe is to look at to compare the voyages of Zheng He and Columbus, say. Okay. Eventually, Columbus is the 15th century, the very end of the 15th century. By the end of the 16th century, you have Europeans are building larger ships, and there's larger movements of people and stuff like that. Okay. But it basically gives you one little paragraph on these voyages. Okay, it's not. It's part of a paragraph. It says the Emperor Yongle who reigned from 1403 to 1424, launched a series of naval expeditions that went as far as Malindi in East Africa. Yongle's successors discontinued the expeditions, but maintained the centralized state that Hongwu had established, whatever that means. Okay, now that's a very short paragraph, a very short mention of these voyages. I have a book here, The Origins of the Western World. I think I've shown it to you before. I searched for a PDF for it that was easily accessible. There are PDFs, but I don't know what the conditions are. You might have to give your email address and stuff like that, which I don't like to do. For the American history, the U.S. history classes, I was able to find PDFs for both a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, which you might be interested in. Lies My Teacher Told Me. And that's available as a PDF where you just click on the button and there it is. You know, you can download it to your computer and read it, you know, at your leisure. I don't require it. It might just help you understand why you hate history, you know, after high school. And there's some stuff about Columbus in there. It's a good book. And also Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States is available on PDF. And that's a great, for U.S. history, that's a great book. I couldn't find a PDF for this one. But let me just read a little description of these voyages. Because I was in my 40s probably before I ever heard of these. I don't know if they talk about them in school these days. Of course, I was not paying attention in global history in freshman year of high school in 1967. I was, I don't know, thinking about music or something, I don't know. He says, in the autumn of 1405, the largest fleet of ships the world had ever seen, or would see for another 500 years, began assembling in the mouth of the Yangtze River on China's eastern coast. Over 300 ships, manned by 27,000 sailors, waited for the reliable winter monsoon winds to begin blowing from the northwest to take them south toward Indonesia and then west through the Strait of Malacca into the Indian Ocean, where they had set Calicut, a major trading city on India's west coast, as their destination. Okay? 300 ships manned by 27,000 sailors. Okay? How many ships does Columbus have? He's got 3 ships. I think the entire crew for all 3 ships is like 86 men. You can look it up. I usually, you know, if this was a classroom, I would just ask you to, you know, take out your phone and look up how many people were on his voyage. Okay. And also, there's the size of his ships. We'll get to that. He says they're under the command of a guy named Admiral Zheng He, and he gives some of the reasons they're going out there. And I'm going to skip over those parts. It's a whole thing about money and copper coins, etc., etc. To prepare for these voyages, China had undergone a frenzy of shipbuilding between 1404 and 1407. Some 1,681 ships were built, 1681. Okay? The largest, the gigantic 9-masted treasure ships of Admiral Zheng He, were about 400 feet long and 160 feet wide, longer than an American football field. And I always wonder, when did an American football field become a unit of international measure? I really have no idea. I don't know exactly, I don't remember the figures for Columbus's ships, but I think all 3 of them would fit on one of these 9-masted treasure ships. Okay? There were other ships of the fleet, ranging in size and function. They carried horses, goods for trade, supplies, water tankers, and marines, soldiers, okay? Some were warships bristling with cannons and rockets. And it makes the point that so much wood was required to build these ships that they sort of deforested the southeast coast of China. And they had to, have logs come down the river to the shore. down the Yangtze River to the shipyards. So it's an enormous undertaking compared to Columbus's voyage. And yet, what you have to always remember is it wasn't easy for Columbus to get those 3 ships and those 86 men. He had to go ask the Portuguese, and then the Spanish, and then the French, and I think he went to the English. Then he went back to Spain, and somehow they changed their minds, and Isabella and Ferdinand, pulled together to give them the 3 ships and the 86 men. Okay, not a single one of the kingdoms in Europe had the resources that were available to the Emperor of China, this Yongle Emperor. Okay. Now, I won't do too much. Let's see. He says, altogether, the Chinese mounted 7 2-year voyages. And the voyage took 2 years because you had to wait for the favor. It's all wind power. So you have to wait for the winds to carry you back. 7 2-year voyages between 1405 and 1433. Chinese ships sailed as far as Mozambique on the east coast of Africa. Now, I don't know how many of you are into maps. I was driving home from Jersey last week, and I got to a point where the GPS was just making me discombobulated because you don't get any overview of what's going, where you're going. It says, 206 north, or it's like, what direction's north? I have no idea. So I actually bought a road atlas, like old school stuff, just to get a picture of where things are at. Maps are incredibly important. When you're reading something like this and it says Mozambique on the east coast of Africa, you have to look at a map and say, oh, there's Mozambique. And here's China. And they've sailed all the way across the Indian Ocean to get there. Into the Persian Gulf they went, all around the Indian Ocean and throughout the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. That's today's Indonesia, the Spice Islands. They navigated their huge ships through unknown waters and into unfamiliar harbors. They traded with local rulers, collected curiosities such as rare gems and even a giraffe, and in a few instances intervened in local affairs to install rulers more friendly to China. Why would you grab up a giraffe? Because they're weird. The Chinese have never seen anything like that. There's another account of this. It says giraffes, zebras, and ostriches, because those are the 3 weirdest animals you can find in Africa, I guess. Right? Now he goes on to talk about this connection between China and the Muslim lands. Zheng He himself is a Muslim. And he has a Muslim pilot because Arabic is the language of trade and commerce in the Indian Ocean. Okay, most of the trading networks have been set up by Muslims. Okay, so it's sort of like English is today, or French was a century or two or three centuries ago. Okay, well, Latin at one point was you call it the lingua franca, the French tongue, basically. And because in the, I don't know, 1700s, 1800s, into the 1800s, French is the language that everybody speaks as a second language in many cases, but for French people, it's a first language. Arabic was that way in the Indian Ocean. And then, just as sort of, the emperor has the power to like start this whole understanding, this whole enterprise, and he also has the power to stop it, to cut it off. And there's a couple of different parties at the court, around the emperor. Zheng He is a member of the Unix group, and the other group is the scholar bureaucrats that Westerners call mandarins. Not the little oranges that you get at Wegmans in a little cute wooden box, but the scholar bureaucrats. And they're more concerned with agriculture and defending China from nomads, etc., etc. Okay? So now, the state pulls back, and the Chinese Empire isn't sending out any more ships, but Chinese merchants on their own are continuing to trade in the Indian Ocean. Okay, that's an important thing. Let's see. I think that's that's the gist of that. Okay. Now that's all under the Qing dynasty. Okay. I think it's 1368 to 1644 is that dynasty, and then it's supplanted by a dynasty, the Manchu dynasty, or the Ming dynasty, that runs from 1644 to 1911. Okay, and in 1911 there's a revolution and they set up a republic. So it becomes, it's the end of dynasties for the foreseeable future and probably forever. Okay. Now I bring this thing about the voyages up because it really indicates that China has, the Chinese emperor has much more resources at his command than any of the rulers in Europe. And some of them are very powerful, but he's more powerful, okay? Because the Chinese have the same sort of immunities that Europeans have, there's no problem, there's no great dying in China. Right? And for that reason, it's really it's difficult for the Europeans to get a foothold in China and Japan. Okay, the chapter starts off with this thing about chiming clocks and Matteo Ricci, and not sure about all of that. But it is sort of like missionaries that start the process of I don't know if you'd call it opening up China, but they get friendly with the emperor. They learn Mandarin. They learn a little bit of the language. They learn the customs, and maybe they start to dress like Chinese people, and bring things like chiming clocks to amaze and impress the emperor and stuff like that. At some point, they begin to convert Chinese. These are Franciscans and Jesuits, so they're converting them to Catholicism. Right? And I'm not sure that the Chinese are bothered by that, okay? China probably is the most secular of any of the world civilizations. There are Buddhists in China, certainly, and maybe some other religions, but the main force is a philosophy of Confucianism that doesn't really have a deity. It doesn't have gods and saints and angels and that kind of stuff. It's a much more, worldly kind of thing. And but the Franciscans or the Jesuits come in and they sort of treated well and all that. But once they start demanding that Chinese peasants cease practicing their traditional religions, ancestor worship and stuff like that, and that gets them into the hot water. Okay, the same thing happens in Japan. At some point, the Japanese are like, "Wait, everybody's becoming Catholic. We can't have that," and And so they start to restrict European access to China and Japan. Okay? And there's nothing the Europeans can really do about it. In China, Europeans are limited to one seaport town, sometimes called Canton, like in Cantonese, but it's also called Guangzhou, and you'll have to look in the book for the spelling. If I tried to write it on the board, it would be a whole thing with the camera angles and stuff like that. And so for, I don't know, 1600s to 1700s, they aren't able to expand that until the middle of the 19th century, 1840 exactly. Okay? So they restricted to this one spot, and they are, and there's nothing the Europeans can do about it. They do send a guy, I think his name is George McCartney. He's got like two of the Beatles' names. George McCartney, Ringo, Lennon, George McCartney. I guess he's a diplomat, and they send him to meet up with the Chinese emperor and ask him if they could trade in more cities. And there's a whole thing about, people that have are lucky enough to have an audience with the emperor are supposed to kowtow to him, which I think means get laid all the way down on the floor, like flat on the floor, and kiss the floor in front of the emperor. All right, it's not something that Europeans want to do, and there's a whole big thing with McCartney and that. But basically, the emperor says, "Well, no, you're not going to get any other concessions." And he writes a letter to, I think it's King George III, this is 1796, saying, when you guys start behaving, then maybe we'll let you trade in other cities. And the English are just like at a loss. There's nothing they can do. And later, when they have, they're further industrialized and stuff, they'll be able to come in with steam-powered ships and that kind of thing, and they basically they become drug smugglers. They smuggle opium into China, opium that's grown in their other colony, India. Okay, and they smuggle it into China, and at some point there's an inspector or somebody that burns up a whole warehouse full of opium, and that's what starts the war. The war is basically a war fought by the English, the British, so that they can sell opium to the Chinese in various cities. Okay? And eventually they will, they'll sell and buy other things, etc., etc. But opium is the key to get in there. In Japan, they do a same thing, a similar thing. They restrict the Europeans to the island city of Nagasaki, I guess. And they also won't deal with anybody but the Dutch. That's the only Europeans they want to deal with. So if you want to trade with Japan, you have to find like a Dutch agent who will do the actual trading for you. I know you load them up someplace else, and there you go. And I've never read an explanation why the Dutch, but I've tried to figure it out. The Dutch are Protestants, and the Dutch Reformed Church leans on Calvinism a lot. And Calvinism has as one of its main ideas predestination, meaning that, well, God knows everything, So even before you're born, he knows if you're going to hell or you're going to heaven. And you can't change that. Okay? Other people don't know exactly who's going to hell and who's going to heaven. But they make a stab at it. You know, there are Calvinists all over Europe, but the Dutch are pretty loose about who's in town and who's living in their territory and stuff like that. But I'm pretty sure they figure the Japanese are not going to heaven. You know, the Japanese are probably condemned, and therefore they don't try to the word is proselytize. They don't try to win them over to the Dutch Reformed Church. They're just there to make a buck, and that's fine with the Japanese, and it's fine with the Dutch. So that's the way it goes. Okay. One other thing I want to say about China. We'll go back to the scholar bureaucrats, because this is an important concept. And depending on which dynasty you're talking about, they have these civil service exams that are either in place or not so much in place. We're talking about the Qing and the Ming dynasty. The one before the Qing is the Mongol dynasty. And they were outsiders from outside of China. It's a short-lived dynasty, and they just let the whole system fall apart. But the way the system works is students go to the equivalent of like, an SAT prep kind of place. Right? Your family has to be fairly well-to-do, wealthy, in order to afford the lessons that you'll need to pass the tests. Okay. You have to read all of the classical Confucian works, and you have to have good calligraphy to write your essays and stuff like that. So it's not something every peasant can do. Probably no peasants can do it. But the people that take the test and pass the test are then able to get jobs in the government. And if you don't want a job in the government, it still gives you a certain amount of prestige when you go back to the village. And in the village, this class of people are like the influential people in the village. The rich, reasonably rich, influential people. They're running things, they're organizing projects and stuff like that. But in the government, these are the guys that are basically, there's the emperor and then this army of civil servants. Yeah. Now, there's two reasons you have a civil service exam. The first one is to make sure people know what they're doing, You don't want to hire a guy to do whatever and find out he has no idea what he's doing, okay? So you want to make sure they're professional, meaning they have the skills and the attitude and the ability to do the job in a professional way. And it also removes like corruption and nepotism and stuff like that. People hiring their relatives who are completely unqualified. It reminds me of somebody. Okay, so you have to pass this exam, and it creates a group of people who are highly literate, which means they can read, they can write, they can argue ideas, and they can deal with stuff like that. And they have this going back a long, long time. And it's only recently, sort of in Europe, maybe the 1300s, that literacy starts to make any growth, starts to have any growth. And but China's had that already, for a long time. There's a guy named Charlemagne who gets crowned the Holy Roman Emperor in 800, and he cannot read and he cannot write. So it's there wouldn't have been anybody close to the throne in China that didn't read or didn't write. Never mind the guy that's sitting on the throne. They all had those skills. In another textbook, it said something about, I guess it's talking about the humanist movement in the Renaissance, and they said that they were creating the first literate class that Europe had seen in 1,000 years. So 500, and then 1,000 years of illiteracy and nobody really knowing how to read or Greek or Latin or anything. And then beginning in sort of 1500, it sort of starts to break out. The printing press is invented somewhere along the line. There are some interesting developments in China. They start bringing in American crops to help feed people and sort of vary their diet more. And I guess I should say some things about Japan, although I'm not really that conversant with Japan. But Japan is very different from China. China has an emperor, and he, kind of runs a tight ship, I guess. Japan is like more feudal. It's like different warlords and shoguns and daimos and these different guys. And there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of politics between those guys. They do have an emperor. I don't think he's as secure as the Chinese emperor is. I don't know how much trade the Japanese do. I've never sort of studied Japan, so it's a little confusing. In fact, I was cheated out of some education on Japan. Maybe that's why I sort of shy away from it. But when I was an undergraduate at Brooklyn College, they had something called the core curriculum, and one of the core curriculum courses was like, in one semester you would study 3 different areas that were outside of Europe and the United States. Non-white people land, I guess. And the semester I took it, I had a guy named Spalding for Mexico or Latin America. Maybe it was Mexico, but in a focus in a larger area. There was a woman whose name I can't remember who taught us about Nigeria, and there was supposed to be a guy teaching us about Japan. He was on a trip to Japan and he stayed there. He said, I'll take a sabbatical or whatever it was. So I never got my Japanese stuff in. So I do have it down from once the United States sends a fleet there and forces it to open up, I have a little better idea of what's going on there. If you have any questions, let me know. And I know I have to assign an artifact assignment pretty soon. I'll probably do it tonight. Okay. And I did put up an announcement about deadlines. Don't be crazy about deadlines. All right. If I put 2 deadlines in and one is later than the other, it's always the later one. Okay. I'm always willing to give you more time so that I get better papers than having a crappy paper that's handed in early is not really what we're looking for here. So, all right. Anybody have any questions? But nobody's here, so how can I ask questions? I don't know. All right. I'll post this as soon as I can. And I am still going to work on maybe some point doing a Zoom type, I think it's collaborate. So has anybody done that in their class? Maybe let me know.